Greetings, and welcome to The World According to Pleiades on KFUG Radio in Crescent City, California, 101.1 FM. The 1-hour weekly radio program that covers everything from alternative medicine, hypnosis, meditation, success, human interaction, alien abduction, and the question of, what is reality anyway, to name but a few. And tonight we are welcoming back Catherine Schulze. Last time it was what I call All About the Beatles Part 1. So this will be All About the Beatles Part 2. Interestingly enough, she's actually done research involving the Beatles. And I'd like you to, if you would be so kind, well, first I want to welcome you back. Thank you for coming back for Part 2.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You're welcome. And after our last interview, when we were talking, you realized something, and you wanted to start this interview off
I realized almost immediately after I said it, I drew a blank. When I was talking about Ringo's wife, I drew a blank on her name, and I guessed it was Martha. I was actually close, and there's more to that, though. Okay, her name is actually Marlene. And I know where I got the Martha from. That's actually the name of Paul's dog.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's
so
cool.
I knew it was an M-A-R name, and I couldn't recall off the top of my head what it was. But yeah, it was Marlene.
Okay, thank you. And you know what? See, I mean, already I'm learning something. I didn't even know Paul had a dog, so that's totally cool. Now, something I wanted to mention during the last interview, this is kind of like catch-up time for things that I didn't mention or whatever. You have a Facebook group about the Beatles. What is that about?
Okay, when we did the class, it was originally our study group, and it was for Rochester University's Beatles music history class on the Beatles. And then when we finished the class, I looked over what they had on Facebook and realized Facebook has a lot of Beatles fan pages. And so I looked at the fact that we had already discussed a lot about their music. So I made this, turn the page, the name of the page is now The Beatles Impact. And it's about how the Beatles music has affected culture and other musicians and not just them as a band, but them as solo artists.
Nice. Very nice. So if someone wanted to become a part of your Facebook group, how would they do that?
They would come on and they would request membership. The reason I have it as set as a private group where they have to request membership is in case there's anybody that's like, because it's supposed to be a group where people can come and talk about their fanship with the Beatles without getting any weirdness or anything associated with that. So I have it set up so that I can remove people that are problems.
Gotcha. Yeah, that only makes good sense. So if someone wanted to be in your group, what would they do? They would like log on to Facebook or find Facebook and then type in something?
They would log on to Facebook and they would search for the Beatles Impact. Okay. And it would come up probably, and then they go in there and there's a thing where they can request to join. And I usually accept people right away to start with, so
okay, thank you.
So it's usually not a problem.
Okay, thank you. So I have some questions, notes that I made from our conversation after the interview last time. I could start there, or if you already have some spaces you'd like to move into, then we could go with that. What would you like?
You can go ahead and start with the notes if you'd like.
Okay, then I will. Something that was interesting you mentioned, and my note says, Paul in regards to Lennon's death. What was that note about? Why did I write that?
Yeah, I remember a little bit about when John Lennon died and how some of my friends who like the Beatles also, reacted to Paul's reaction. Okay, he was seen by the public in general as being kind of cold in his reaction, and that was a total cultural misunderstanding by American fans. First off, because he's British, and they're a lot more they're taught to be a lot more reserved. And the other part of that is he was in shock because Lennon was assassinated. He didn't get sick, and it wasn't a long process. It was a sudden death. So he's, a friend he's had since childhood, and suddenly gone. He was in shock, and people didn't react well to that.
And it's not like I've actually followed it or anything. So when you say people didn't react well to it, I mean, what?
Well, the press downright said his reaction was cold, and on they didn't like his reaction.
So basically, I mean, would you say that in some ways he was beat up in the press over his reaction, and it was just...
Yeah, he was.
Okay.
For no good reason, because it's like he reacted mostly, and there's, of course, back when the whole thing with Lennon happened, we were still not really talking about in a public forum about the whole stages of grief thing. And how he might have been in shock when the press asked him about it.
Yeah, you had to be in shock.
Yeah, it was and later on, when George died, he had time to prepare for it because George died of throat cancer. Whereas when John died, it was a sudden thing; he was just gone.
Okay.
And it was a so-called fan that killed him. So, yeah, Paul was in shock.
Very, very understandable. And I didn't realize that he had been attacked or anything over his reaction. Basically, I just stepped away from watching anything to do with the news many years ago. So this is all new to me, what you're sharing. But I'm sure for a lot of people it's not new at all. Okay, so you're mentioning, Paul's reaction had to do with he was British and all that. So another note I made is in comparing their upbringings. I just took quick notes as we were talking. Does that ring a bell at all?
A little bit. Well, John, of course, was raised by his aunt. His mother and his father weren't in the picture. Whereas Paul, he had a younger brother, and he had his parents there and stuff. And his mother died though when he was. I think he was like a preteen when his mother died. So he had to deal with the loss of a parent through death. Okay. And then he had a younger sibling and stuff. Where John also had younger siblings, but he had younger siblings through his mother. He had some sisters, a couple sisters through his mother that were like stepsister or half sisters. So, whereas George was like I don't know if he was the youngest or I can't remember. I think he was the youngest of a large family.
Okay.
Or no, he was the second to the youngest. He was of a large family. So he had a lot of siblings and stuff. And I think Ringo was an only child, if I remember right. So they all had they lived in Liverpool, but they all had slightly different upbringings. And it kind of affected the personalities that they brought away from it.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Any comments on how that impacted their relationship, like in working with each other? Like, one person might have been an only child, another person came from a large family. Does anything leap at you? I mean, this question just came off the top of my head.
I think that George coming from a larger family might have been the reason why George was, as I said, kind of a peacemaker in the band, is because he was used to dealing with conflict of, like siblings and stuff probably, and it probably, although I guess he had some of his siblings were quite a bit older than him but it would have affected him in that way by feeling that being used to maybe making the peace and stuff with people. Whereas John, he was kind of isolated in a way, him and his aunt, and and his mother was over here, and and then his mother died when he was like a teenager, and he never really, it's like he never really got to know her. So yeah, it would be different.
Okay.
So
yeah.
So in a way, Paul and John had a similarity, as they both lost their mother through death. But John had already felt like he lost her because he wasn't really raising him.
Okay.
So that would definitely make difference.
Okay.
And yeah.
Now, a question that jumped into my head, and it's nothing we talked about, but it's occurring to me. Is there anything about any of them, John, Paul, George, or Ringo, that comes into your mind that you feel basically the world at large has misunderstood or doesn't know about, and you feel it's important? I mean, because you have done some research and you know these people more in depth than the average bear. Is there any perhaps public misunderstandings outside of what you've already touched on that you would like to share right now, just to help enlighten people? Well,
I do think that as individual musicians, especially George as a guitar player and Ringo as a drummer, were kind of underrated. I had looked in when we talked before. I said, well, I didn't really have a lot of background on Ringo, and even when I looked it up, I didn't really get a lot more background on it. But what I've noticed about Ringo is he did actually have a lot of respect, even with other bands and stuff in Liverpool, as a drummer. So he was already kind of respected among the local bands as a drummer when he joined the Beatles. So he was actually a fairly decent drummer before he even started working with them. So he might have been a bit underrated as a drummer. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is they found, what recently, I was just reading today, they recently found when they were or George Martin revealed that there were solos in one of the songs that they had. That was a solo that George had done that was an incredible guitar solo that got left out of one of the songs. So, because it didn't fit with the style of music they were doing at the time, I guess.
Okay.
But it's like, yeah, they were, there was no one like the Beatles, basically. And I think a lot of people realize that, though, but, yeah.
Another question that's just popped into my head. How were the Beatles received by American musicians? Any comments on that?
Well, as far as how American musicians perceived them, I think some. Well, the story that always gets me is when I hear about the time. Did I mention last time the time that the Beatles met Elvis Presley? Did I tell you about that? I probably did already.
I'm just not sure. So I'm thinking probably not. Go ahead and share that if you will.
Well, when they were, okay, for one thing, John Lennon personally kind of idolized Elvis Presley. And so they were kind of excited about meeting him. Well, he didn't wanted them, actually, he didn't really want to meet them. He kind of wanted them deported.
Oh my God. Okay.
Yeah, he kind of wanted to get rid of them. And I think the reason why is they kind of scared him a little bit because they were the new, they were the new way music was going. And it's really bad. Somebody they idolized actually didn't want them here.
Ouch. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I think they were later American bands that came later. I think the Beatles helped influence American bands that came later. Because they not only did they influence them as a group themselves, but they influenced them as making them look more to British music when they were looking for influences. Where American bands before might have focused more on finding influences in American blues and different bands like that, they actually were looking more to stuff in Great Britain and bringing in more influences from over there than they did before.
Okay, but initially it wasn't. If I'm hearing this right, it doesn't seem like it was unfair to say that American musicians, not necessarily as a whole, but certainly some, just viewed them as more competition with a new,
maybe a little bit
with a new sound, which would be extra threatening.
But they got along. They got along good. There was a lot of big musicians at the time, like Bob Dylan and Simon and Garfunkel, and these different musicians that they actually got on along famously with.
Excellent.
That were there,
Excellent. Did Elvis ever come around?
I don't know if he really ever did. I think he kind of had to just accept they were going to be here, whether he liked it or not.
Which isn't really saying he invited them over and they all became tight.
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess though that John Lennon did get to jam with Elvis Presley though.
Oh, okay. So
that made John happy anyhow.
Yeah. I mean, that's something. I mean, and hopefully they had
the craziest thing about it, of course, Brian Epstein and Colonel Parker arranged the meeting in the first place. Their managers arranged it. The craziest thing about it is the only pictures they have of that major historical musical event is basically them getting in and getting out of their cars.
Oh, wow. Are there any recordings? Or?
I don't think so. I don't think they did a lot of photographing or recording of any of that.
Wow. I mean, it seems
it
like
was like a major historical.
Yeah. It seems like it was the perfect opportunity for publicity. It seems like the managers would have arranged it for publicity, but somehow it wasn't used as publicity. What?
I think it's kind of like Brian knew that John really wanted to meet him, and so Brian talked Colonel Parker into arranging it, is what I think happened.
Okay, so it wasn't really arranged as a publicity event. It was arranged as a, hey, this guy idolizes Elvis. Let's get them together. Come on, do me a favor.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's kind of beautiful. I'm like happy to hear that they actually got together. So I have another note. And you can just assume I'm referring to my notes. Hamburg. Why did I write down Hamburg?
Oh, Hamburg. That's where they got their start as far as touring outside of Liverpool. Okay. And they went there, and Hamburg, Germany, which is a really rough town. And the first time they went there and they played, and they were playing these venues, and they did just like bars and stuff, and it was really kind of a rough gig in general. But what happened is the first time they went over there, when they originally went over there, they still had Stuart Sutcliffe with them, and they still had Pete Best with them. And they went over and they toured. But you know what happened? George Harrison was not 18 yet. So he got himself deported because he got thrown out of the country because he wasn't old enough to be doing those gigs at the places they were doing them at.
Oh wow, they were so rough that they said, "Hey, this guy's underage, deport him."
Yeah, basically.
Wow, that's pretty rough.
Yeah.
Colorful, very colorful.
Yeah, it kind of gave them, I think, a little bit of an edge to their music. It's funny because them going there gave them an edge, and then them meeting Brian Epstein, he kind of polished them again. So they kind of had a musical edge of experience, and yet they were kind of polished so that the American audience could handle them.
That's pretty excellent, though, that they did have that rough stuff, because that helped to build character, if you will.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's pretty good. Is there anything else? How long were they in Hamburg, or was it kind of they kept going back, or what?
They went back. I think they went back a couple times because I think, as I said, the first time they couldn't stay because and Stuart met a woman there, and they ended up being a couple and stuff there. I believe, actually ended up dying there because And there's some beautiful, his girlfriend took some beautiful, dark, interesting, artsy photos of the Beatles back then, too. She was a photographer. And she's a German girl that took all these pictures of them and stuff, and it's really cool. One of these times I've got to show you these pictures that she took of them because they're really, really cool.
Okay. Where would a person find those pictures online if they wanted to take a look?
Well, I have some of them at my group.
Okay.
I have photo albums in there, and I put some of the photo album in the photo album. I put some pictures.
Okay.
But
and
you can look up Beatles Hamburg, and you could probably find photos.
Okay, Beatles Hamburg. In case someone's just joined us and they're interested in what we're talking about, and they'd like to become a member of your group, could you tell us again how to find your group and how to join it?
If you go into Facebook and you search for the Beatles Impact, you can find it.
Okay, Beatles Impact, and that'll take you to the Beatles Facebook page of the person I'm interviewing today, Catherine Schulze, Beatles researcher. Now, how about this next point, the scandal around Paul being dead?
Oh yeah, there were so many so-called clues about that where there was this thing. Okay, first off, there's this you've heard the song "The Day in a Life."
Yeah.
And he blew his mind out in a car. He didn't know the light had changed. Okay, he was talking. Okay, that was supposedly a clue that Paul had died in a car accident.
Okay.
But it actually was about somebody from the House of Lords that John read about in the newspaper.
Okay.
But that was one of the first clues where they thought Paul was dead. And it wasn't that they thought Paul was dead. They thought they found a guy who could play bass and sing, and they had plastic surgery done on him so that he looked like Paul McCartney. So there are still people that believe this crazy thing.
Wow.
That believe the guy that is alive today is still is somebody else and is not actually Paul McCartney.
That's fascinating. Maybe you just mentioned it and it went right by me, but how did this all start? I mean, where did this rumor start?
Well, people started picking up these weird clues in songs and on albums and stuff. The one that's really big that a lot of people have probably heard of is the Abbey Road cover. Okay, according to the Paul is Dead people, the Abbey Road cover is a funeral progression because John is dressed as a minister, supposedly. This is the theory. Ringo is dressed as, sometimes they say Ringo is dressed as a mourner, and sometimes they say Ringo is dressed as a funeral parlor curator. And Paul is apparently in UK, they bury, according to the theorist people, in the UK they bury people with no shoes. That's why Paul's barefoot.
Why? Any idea? I'm just curious.
Why? Maybe because usually when you have an open coffin, you don't see the feet anyhow.
Okay. I just wondered.
And then supposedly George Harrison is dressed as a gravedigger. And Paul is walking out of step with the rest of them. He's walking out of step with the rest of them. Probably because he's left-handed, because left-handed people aren't left-handed, they're left-bodied, and they start with their left foot rather than their right foot.
Interesting.
So they do walk out of sync usually with right-handed people. That's what I think is the reason why for that.
Okay.
But that's not what they see. They see it as a proof. Other supposed proof is in Taxman, George mentions putting cover pennies on your eyes. And in a couple places, there's supposedly backward masking that they claim is things like, there's one of them, that one song, I think it's Revolution Number 9, play it backwards. Supposedly it says, I buried Paul, I'll miss him, I'll miss him, is what John says when you reverse it.
Okay.
That's not what he says. He claims there is none. Somebody said, somewhere it's been said that he actually says something completely different that's kind of nonsense. Mm-hmm. But, yeah, some people said that it was him saying Paul was dead.
Interesting. Now, back to the picture. How is, and maybe it doesn't even make any sense, but how is Paul walking out of sync proof that he's dead? I mean, I don't even get it.
Or because it's like he's he's passed on, and like it's symbolic that he's not alive anymore, is because he's walking out of sync. I don't know.
Yeah.
They were grasping at straws, basically, looking for any reason.
Because if he was already dead and him walking out of sync is proof of it, it's like, didn't somebody stop to think, but he's alive in the picture? I mean,
well, that's supposed to be his double in the picture.
Oh, okay. So my question is, did the Beatles play into this? And how long did it really last? From what you said, there are some people that still believe it. There was a period of time
where John and Paul were fighting.
Yeah.
And there is a song called "How Do You Sleep at Night" by John Lennon, where he was fighting with Paul, and it said those people were right when they said that you were dead.
Interesting.
So John Lennon, whether he did it he might have just did it out of spite with Paul. Mm-hmm. He plays into it a little bit at one point in time.
Okay.
But the rest of them, no, not really. Although I think somebody said something about Ringo saying something about it at one point where he kind of sounded like he was playing into it too. So I don't know. There was a period of time where the Beatles weren't all getting along with each other very well.
Okay, and would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, it first kind of shows up where there's infighting with the group. There's a song by Paul called "We Can Work It Out," and that's actually when they were still, the Beatles, and it's kind of about that. But it gets a little interesting when they go their separate ways, and you get songs like George has the song "All Things Must Pass," and a lot of that is about moving on from being a Beatle to being George Harrison solo artist. And it's like John's song "God," in his song "God" there says, "I don't believe in the Beatles. I just believe in me."
Yeah, I remember that.
And it's funny, because when John and Paul, they were putting little interjections to each other. John did the "How Did You Sleep at Night" song, which was a direct attack at Paul. And Paul does a song called "Dear Friend," which is basically the same thing. Ringo did a song called "Back Off Boogaloo," which is basically a song telling them to stop fighting.
Okay.
It's basically what the song's about. He's getting tired of John and Paul fighting all the time, and that's he wrote "Back Off Boogaloo" as a reaction to that.
Interesting. So, John.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I have something. There's and there was there was all kinds of things going on with that, though. They do a lot, and you notice when you go through their songs and stuff, they did a lot of communicating to each other and to other people about stuff in their songs. They say, write what you know. And the Beatles really did do that.
Definitely. So one of my notes from our last talk was songs about each other, and it sounds like you're already in there.
Yeah, this is and another light talking about songs they wrote about each other is Paul, George, and Ringo all wrote songs about John after he died. That were, especially Paul's was especially touching because Paul's was very emotional about his song. He was able to get out. It's called his song is called Here, and people might want to make notes of these if they hadn't heard them because it's kind of interesting to hear these. It's called Here Today. Is the one that Paul wrote about John. Mm. And George's was called All Those Years Ago.
Okay.
And I think you might have heard, a lot of people have heard the song All Those Years Ago, because that was pretty...
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's about John Lennon.
As a matter of fact, I'm remembering that I've heard it. I'm not remembering really the words or anything, but I'm getting this feeling of melancholy. Is that right? Or
yeah, it is kind of a melancholy song.
Okay.
It's a lovely song, but yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's beautiful. I remember that. It's just the kind of song that reaches inside of you and touches you. Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Yeah. He was, and Ringo's song about John was called "Imagine Me There." Ringo also wrote a song about George after George passed. Ringo, as I said before, he had a habit of picking up stuff from other things. Well, "Imagine Me There," he used "Imagine," like John's famous song "Imagine," and pulled that into the song. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And he did the same thing when he did the George song. The George song is really, in the titles even touching, is called "Never Without You." Within you, without you. That's what he kind of pulled that one from.
Okay.
He's gotten better over the years in his songwriting, because I think we talked before about how he's having a hard time when he was with the Beatles, but over the years he's gotten a lot better at crafting Ringo's songs.
So that's interesting. And please forgive me for just not being aware of this, but how many Beatles are left right now?
Just Paul and Ringo.
Paul and Ringo. And
Ringo's actually touring in Buenos Aires right now.
Okay, so are they both still active, or?
Yeah, and Paul just recently did Saturday Night Live's 40th year anniversary.
Wow!
And he just recently released a video, a song for a video game that's actually really lovely. If you get a chance to see the actual video for it, it's like a virtual reality type music video. So he's gone, really, he follows the trends kind of. He's very good at that.
Mm-hmm. What is the music video's title, if I wanted to look for it?
Oh, gosh. I know it's Future. Oh, gosh.
Yeah, you didn't know there was going to be a test, did you? That's okay. I'm thinking if I just type in like Paul McCartney virtual reality video, something will come up, right?
Yeah, McCartney, and I think it's something for the future. Seeing if I can find it in my notes, because I knew there were things I wanted to talk about. Oh no, but you don't find it. But yeah, he does have a recent video, and if you can catch. If you can catch people who have Hulu can catch the 40th anniversary of Saturday Night Live. He's on that too. He was on that actually with Paul Simon.
Oh wow! So Paul Simon is still around.
Yeah, Paul Simon's still around.
Wow! You haven't taken a course on Paul Simon, have you?
No.
Okay, I just thought I'd ask. How about, I know this isn't on the topic of the Beatles, but now I just have to ask, Art Garfunkel, did he pass on ages ago or what?
I don't know, because Paul went solo quite a while ago.
Yeah, ages ago. Tons of time ago. Okay, I was just, that's totally off topic, but still, it's all in the mix. Is there anything from your notes that you would like to bring into the interview today?
Well, we kind of covered a lot of stuff already from my notes.
Well, how about Paul's reaction in relation to George's death? You kind of touched on that a little when we were talking about the media's misinterpretation of Lennon's death. But what about George?
Well, he said that he's really going to miss him, and that his reaction Paul's reaction to George's death was almost like somebody would react to like their younger brother dying.
Mm.
So it was a lot more. He had time to prepare though, because George died of cancer.
Yeah.
Which is a slower process. So he had time to go through the shock process of George's dying and move on to the grieving process. So by the time the press approached him, and the press has a bad tendency to not know when they should leave people alone.
Mm.
You know?
Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that?
Sorry, I didn't necessarily mean you of it. Yeah,
I'm just teasing. So not to get all dark or anything, but in relation to, I mean, because we're touching on these topics anyway. In relation to tragedy, what Beatle comes to mind? That in your mind has suffered the most tragedy so far in this life, and why?
Okay, let me see. Well, I mean, yeah, I know John had the whole being abandoned thing and stuff and different things, but in a way, I think that because Paul had to deal with John's death, he had to deal with George's death, he had to deal with, when he was a kid, he had to deal with his mother's death, he had to deal with Linda's death.
Hmm.
He had to deal with getting married to somebody that turned out to not be so great after Linda. He's had to deal with Michael Jackson stabbing him in the back.
Ouch.
Yeah,
That's
so
a lot. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so he has had to deal with, it comes, that you can see how much dignity and stuff he has, is that he comes up, he's still good-natured, even after all this.
Yeah, that's, that really says a lot about him as a person, as his character. And as I mentioned in our last interview, back so many years ago when he was busted in Japan for possession of pot, I believe it was, and it prevented his concert from happening because he was incarcerated, and his response to that was when they let him out, he gave a free concert. So, and I mean, that's not really hearsay. I actually heard that on the news. Not that I believe everything in the news, but I mean, I did hear it on the news back when I was a kid, and it just sounded so magnificent. Yeah. So I mean, it just really says a lot. And when I asked you the question,
I got it. I found it in my notes. That song I was mentioning, so that you can Google it later.
Yeah.
Is "Hope for the Future."
Hope for the Future.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And that's in relation to the virtual reality music video by Paul McCartney?
By Paul McCartney, yes.
Excellent, thank you. As I mentioned a moment ago, when I asked you the question about, which Beatle off the top of your head you feel has, suffered the most, basically, Paul already had my vote. Now, I was curious as to what you would say, because you're the expert, in my opinion. I mean, and so, apparently what little I know was already enough to put him in that category, and what a great guy. I mean, I didn't realize it till just now, but I think I love Paul McCartney. I mean, I'm serious. I haven't sat down to think about this, really. And,
he's just great. Well, and I think they were all really remarkable people, so it's like, it was really hard to think about that for a bit there, but it's like he had to deal with all that stuff, and he still bounced back good-natured and, ready to continue on and do more music and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So
that is a cool thing, but
About how old is he now, anyway? I have no idea. I mean,
I have no idea.
Oh, you don't know either?
I don't know either off the top of my head.
That's okay.
I know 70. Okay. I just looked it up. 72.
No way. Really?
Yeah.
Really?
And he's actually younger than Ringo Starr.
Wow. So how the heck old is? Okay. I
only a couple of years older than him.
Okay,
Ringo's only a couple of years older.
Okay. Wow. So in our last interview, I kind of get the impression that there's not as much history available on Ringo as there is on the rest of the Beatles. Now, was that a misunderstanding on my part?
It's hard because there's plenty of history with him after the Beatles. He gets with the Beatles, but when you try to look up stuff about him, most you can find out is that he came from a small family, and that he was a high school dropout, and that he was, as I said, he played with a lot of local bands, and he became a sessions musician for a while there. Mm. And he was basically, his whole life was about playing the drums. Mm. By the time he joined the Beatles, so yeah, okay. He did do. There's a movie that he was in by himself. I don't know if you ever heard of the movie Caveman.
Oh man, yeah, but I don't really remember it. He was in a movie by himself.
It's a goofy movie,
and it was a goofy movie, right?
Yeah, it was very goofy.
Oh, okay. Well, now I'm going to have to look that up and watch it.
It's entertaining, and his character wasn't that bad in it. It's like there were way goofier characters. He wasn't the goofiest character in the movie. Let's put it that way.
Okay. From what you know, who seems to have had the best sense of humor and why? Or is that anything that's come up for you?
Well, they all genuinely had their own sense of humor. As far as I think that Ringo's sense of humor is by far the most laid back of the four of them. He just is kind of mellow and where John's was sarcastic, very sarcastic actually in a lot of ways. It's like I just love watching Hard Day's Night and watching them show Lennon's sense of humor, because he did, some of the stuff he did is just like, so they all had good senses of humor. Mm-hmm. They just showed it in different ways. So it's really hard. I guess you'd have to say Ringo, just because his was the most relaxed. Mm. But they all had pretty good senses of humor.
Okay. And how about hobbies? I mean, what did that come into your research at all? I mean,
hobbies is a tough one. I know that John, he wrote and he drew, and he even painted, I believe.
Ooh, I bet some of his paintings are worth a ton out there.
Yeah.
Wow.
And Paul is very much associated around the music, although if you look online and you look for it, his wife was just a wonderful, she took photography. Do you realize that Linda McCartney also did photography?
Yeah, you know what? I've actually heard that.
She's got to have some of the most famous photos, because she was Paul McCartney's wife, and she was part of Wings, which gave her access to other musicians as well. So there's got to be some fabulous photos by her out there.
Okay.
But she also was a vegetarian cook who wrote her own cookbook. So you can find videos online of Paul trying to doing recipes out of Linda's cookbooks to try to sell her cookbooks. So they like to come up with recipes together, I guess, or something, because she wrote a lot of cookbooks on, but he is to this day very pro, don't eat anything with a face, that vegetarianism is the way to go, and it could be in a part responsible for such longevity for him, that he's had that lifestyle for so long.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that he was big on vegetarianism, that kind of
Here's
thing.
the funny thing about Paul McCartney and his vegetarianism. It was written, you remember The Simpsons? Mm-hmm. Do you remember The Simpsons episode where Linda and Paul McCartney voiced themselves on the show?
No.
There was a Simpsons episode where they voiced themselves on the show, and it was about Lisa had decided to become a vegetarian. Homer's her father, and he's like, he doesn't even, he lives off of pigs practically. He eats so much pork.
Oh my God.
And so they did this bit where she wanted to be a vegetarian. Okay, and they wanted Linda and Paul McCartney to voice themselves on the show. Paul agreed to do that only if they would put in the contract deal that that Lisa would stay a vegetarian for the remainder of the run of The Simpsons.
That's so awesome.
Yeah, that's what I thought, too.
Oh, that's so wicked awesome. Oh, my
and he's
God.
like, I'm Paul McCartney. I could get them to do anything I like, basically. But it was so cool.
That is so wicked cool. No doubt.
She's like the only vegetarian cartoon character I know of.
Oh,
so
man,
it's really
that's
awesome.
intense. I love that. Thank you. I had no clue.
Yeah.
That is so obviously she's, still a vegetarian.
Yeah. Well,
Wow.
that's why.
That is so
it was
cool.
part of the deal.
Nice. Very nice. Speaking of solo careers, I've always loved, Paul McCartney and Wings, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Now, as far as solo careers, life after the Beatles musically goes for the different members of the Beatles, who do you think has, I mean, just, and I don't even know how to ask it, really. Who do you think has had the greatest success musically?
Well, that is really tough because Paul is still going.
Mm.
Well, Ringo's still going too, but Paul, his earlier stuff has had more success to begin with. So Paul has had the biggest longevity, but it's really hard to say because both George and John had really great solo careers because, John did his solo stuff and then he did his stuff with the Plastic Ono Band, and then he kind of got his career cut short. You don't know what would have happened if he'd gotten to do it longer. Mm-hmm. And then Ringo is like, his stuff wasn't really big to begin with, but now his stuff is doing really well. So, as I said, he's touring right now. Mm-hmm. And George, well, he did his solo stuff, but he also did the concert for Bangladesh. He's done the Traveling Wilburys. Mm. Ringo likes to work on his own stuff and stuff right now, but George, I think, did it with the most variety of people when you come right down to it. So it's like really hard to say. It's like, and Paul did, then you got to go back and say, well, Paul did it with Michael Jackson, he did the music with him, and he did his solo stuff, and he had Wings, and so it's really hard to say.
Yeah. And Paul also, was it Paul? He also did a thing with Stevie Wonder, right?
Yeah, I think he did. Oh, the Ebony and Ivory.
Mm-hmm. Who?
And so he's done with other people too. But, and I was going to say, when I was talking about Ringo, I got sidetracked. Actually, I was starting to talk about George, and then I got sidetracked on the Ringo, and I forgot my train of thought. But Ringo has had a band of his own called Ringo's All-Star Band. Mm. And so he's worked with other people too a little bit, but not on the level that Paul and George have.
Yeah. Who was in the group, the Traveling Wilburys?
Okay, that's an interesting story because it was this great idea. This group, it was George Harrison, Tom Petty, Roy Orbison, Bob Dylan.
Wow.
And I'm drawing a blank, a member of, I'm thinking, the one guy who was a member of another band, whose name I can't remember right off the top of my head.
That's okay. It'll come back as soon as we end the interview.
I think he was a member of ELO, is who I think he was a member of, what band I think he was a member of. Okay. I want to say, yeah, but yeah, so it was a big deal because and it was like, so basically this experiment, because the story of the Traveling Wilburys is they're like supposed to all be cousins and they're like the traveling family band. But it's just, it was just incredible because it kind of it worked,
Any idea how long they were together?
The Traveling Wilburys?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't think I think they only made 2 albums.
Okay, because I remember I really liked their stuff, but I mean, I guess with that much freaking talent.
I don't know how putting Tom Petty and Bob Dylan together, though, is so funny because I've had people compare the 2 of them as far as their sound.
Oh, okay, why? I don't even understand.
Well, some people think they sound similar, their voices.
Ah, okay.
I don't see that, but I've had people tell me that before, and I'm like going, I don't really see that.
Out of all the solo Beatle, enterprises, endeavors, do you have a favorite, or would you rather not even say?
Well, there are stuff it's very hard for me to pick a favorite with that because there's stuff I liked that. Well, to be honest, I didn't really get hugely into Ringo stuff, and I kind of feel bad about that because a lot of the fans that are into his stuff, but I liked, there's some stuff when it went in different stages in my life because it had been around so long, it seems like, it's like certain times in my life I was listening to more John Lennon, and certain times in my life I was listening to more Wings, and sometimes I was listening to more of George Harrison solo stuff. It just depended on where I was.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, and in a way, it's like an unfair question because they do cover such a wide time area that.
They do. When you include the solo stuff with the stuff that they did as a group, it covers a large span of time.
Now we're getting close to the end. And I want to ask you, the research, the study that you've done in relation to the Beatles, do you feel that it's impacted your life in any way? Any revelations, realizations? What?
Well, I think the Beatles in general have impacted my life because I literally, because of the fact that I'm a second-generation Beatle fan. Third generation, I'm the second generation of a 3-generation Beatles fan family, actually, because my son's also one. I think it kind of is hard to say how much impact they had because I don't remember a time when I hadn't heard the Beatles, because I grew up hearing them. So, but yeah, I think maybe in a lot of ways their attitudes in their music and stuff did affect who I am as a person, just growing up under that. And just makes me appreciate the music a lot, even more when I actually get down to where I'm studying them and stuff. And I think that really made a difference in my love of their music, is just understanding where they were coming from with it. But it's really hard to say where they impacted me personally because I can't figure out where the impact is and where,
Yeah, interestingly, on a level of reality, creation, vibrations, the Beatles are, and I won't even say have been because they still exist, I mean, in some very real ways, are a vibration that's interwoven into the fabric of this world. I mean, across the entire planet. That is huge.
Yeah, I mean, since I joined the class and the group and stuff, I realized that there's basically Beatles fans in every corner of the globe.
Absolutely. It's like, it's so weird, and I have no idea how this could have happened. Maybe he was kidding me, but it was about maybe 30 years ago, and this guy I was working with, I said something about a song, and it was by the Beatles, and he was like, "Who's that?" And I just couldn't fathom that anybody could even be alive and not know who the Beatles are. And I thought he was kidding, and I called him on it, like, you're kidding, right? And his face indicated that he wasn't kidding, and that still kind of confuses me. It's like, what, was he living in a closet? What the heck happened, But,
yeah.
I mean, there's a part of me that thinks he must have just, really tricked me good to make me think that he wasn't kidding, but he seems sincere, and that's just so odd to me, because it's like somebody not knowing what a light bulb is. I mean, in this world, and conceivably there could be people out there in the world that don't even have light bulbs that have still heard about the Beatles. So now on that note, getting ready to close, I just want to, I'm not sure if we covered this last time or not, or if we just talked about it after the interview, but that whole thing where Beatles albums were being burned, and after I think it was John's comment that was misinterpreted apparently about their popularity. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, John said that he said that they were more, basically he said that they were more popular than going to church, but it got translated to saying that they were bigger than God.
Okay. And
so,
so
he had to basically explain himself in interviews, and it was kind of funny because he explained himself over and over again. That's not what he meant. He was just saying that people were going to Beatles concerts rather than going to church because they were that popular. He didn't mean for people to think he was saying they were bigger than God.
Right, I understand, but some people, for whatever reason, took it and ran with it in the other direction, and they ended up forming groups that burned albums. And
yeah, it's funny how, and it's like it happened throughout their career, really. They had to be really careful with everything they said and did, it seemed like, because it would always get kind of twisted a little bit. It's like the press would grab one thing they said and take it the wrong way and run off with that. It's like, and he tried to explain it, and I think it ended up actually making them more money on the album because they were actually buying the albums to burn them.
That's great. That's just really funny.
So what kind of logic is that? They were still making more money off of them if they bought them.
That's funny. Okay. And I guess on that note, is there anything you'd like to say in closing?
Well, in closing, I guess I'd just say that it's been an interesting interview. I was glad I got to cover some more of that stuff that we talked about before, so that's good.
Well, Catherine, I totally appreciate your being here. Thank you very much. And I'm going to wish you an absolutely beautiful night, and I hope we talk again in the future. Bye for now.
And it controls what we remember. 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 And it controls what we remember.
Thank you for listening to The World According to Pleiades on KFUG Radio in Crescent City, California. If you have any topics you'd like covered, or you feel you have the potential to make a good interviewee, please send your suggestions and or information to KFUG Radio, 270 I Street, Crescent City, California, 95531. Attention, Pleiades. Or email me at radiointerview@moonstar-enterprises.com. That's radiointerview@moonstar-enterprises.com. My name is Pleiades Moonstar, and I love you.